Welcome, chosen one. If you're listening to this, it's not by accident. For years, maybe for as long as you can remember, you've carried a quiet knowing that never quite left you alone. A sense that something beneath the surface wasn't right. A discernment that picked up on shifts, patterns, and fractures long before they became visible to everyone else. You felt it in conversations, in institutions, in leadership, in systems that looked stable on the outside but felt hollow within. Even when you couldn't fully explain it, your spirit recognized it, and that awareness set you apart. But being early comes at a cost. When you spoke what you sensed, when you questioned what others accepted without thought, you weren't met with understanding. You were dismissed, labeled paranoid, negative, dramatic, or too intense. Some laughed it off. Others subtly distanced themselves. They treated your clarity like a problem instead of a gift, because acknowledging what you saw would have required them to confront truths that threatened their comfort. So they mocked the messenger instead of examining the message. And still, you held your ground, not because you wanted to be right, but because truth wouldn't let you stay silent. Scripture has always spoken to this moment. Amos 3-7 reminds us, "Surely the sovereign Lord does nothing without revealing his plan to his servants, the prophets." That doesn't only speak of pulpits and titles, it speaks of alignment. Of those who listen deeply, who perceive before events unfold, who carry insight not because they asked for it, but because they were entrusted with it. You weren't ranting, you were discerning. You weren't imagining things. You were recognizing what was already forming. Psychology confirms what Scripture has long revealed. People instinctively resist truth when it threatens their sense of safety. Comfort will always fight revelation, but chosen ones are not called to preserve comfort, we are called to awaken. That's why rejection wasn't a detour in your life. It was positioning. It separated you from illusions, sharpened your discernment, and prepared you for this hour. And now, look around. The chaos unfolding across the world isn't random. The systems cracking, the exposure, the instability, it's confirmation, not coincidence. What you sensed privately is now playing out publicly. You were early, not wrong. So if something in your spirit is stirring, if you feel a readiness rising that you can't ignore anymore, this is your moment. Type Amen if you know God chose you for this hour. Stay with me until the end. We'll close with a powerful prayer for protection, clarity, and purpose. This is just the beginning. You weren't guessing. You were seeing. Long before the cracks became headlines, before the collapses were named, before the chaos was given language that made it socially acceptable to discuss, you were already aware that something was breaking beneath the surface. While others moved through life distracted, entertained, or comforted by appearances, your spirit was registering tension. You noticed inconsistencies others brushed off. You sensed decay behind polished words and carefully curated images. This wasn't imagination, it was perception. You were bearing witness to a collapse in real time, even when it hadn't yet taken physical form. What made this especially isolating is that your insight didn't come wrapped in credentials or sanctioned authority. You weren't quoting reports, hiding behind titles, or echoing what was already approved to be said. Your awareness came from spiritual sensitivity, from alignment, from listening deeply, feeling deeply, and noticing what couldn't yet be measured. And in a world that only trusts what can be validated by status or consensus, that kind of knowing is often dismissed, not because it lacks truth, but because it exposes how limited conventional vision really is. Your discernment was not accidental, it was sharpened through pain, through experiences that forced you to read between the lines to survive, through betrayal that taught you to recognize patterns, through loss that trained you to sense when something is being held together by denial rather than integrity. Pain refined your perception. It stripped away naivete and replaced it with clarity. What they called overthinking was actually awareness forged under pressure. Still, Because you didn't look like what people expect a seer to look like, they rejected your voice. You didn't fit the image. You weren't elevated on a stage. You weren't wrapped in spiritual language that felt familiar or safe to them. So they labeled you paranoid, emotional, dramatic, anything that allowed them to dismiss the message without confronting its truth. It's easier to question the messenger than to examine the warning. But now, what was once invisible is undeniable. The very structures you sensed were unstable are shaking. The very behaviors you warned would lead to collapse are being exposed. And you're not surprised because you weren't predicting a future event. You were decoding the present. You saw what was already there, long before others were willing to look. What they called bitterness was never bitterness at all. It was burden. And there is a profound difference between the two, one that only becomes clear when time exposes the truth. Bitterness seeks revenge. It feeds on blame and circles endlessly around personal injury. But what you carried was weight, a grief that didn't come from what you lost, but from what you could already see others were about to lose. Bitterness comes empty-handed. Burden comes with receipts, patterns, timelines, evidence unfolding in plain sight for anyone willing to look. You weren't angry because things didn't go your way. You were heavy because you recognized where things were headed. You felt the ache of watching people defend systems that were already failing them. You grieved institutions, relationships, and leaders you once hoped would stand, knowing they were built on compromises that could not hold. That grief didn't make you soft, it made you urgent. And urgency is often misread by those who are still comfortable. Your warnings didn't come from ego or a desire to be seen. If anything, they came from love. From the kind of love that risks rejection to speak truth anyway. You didn't gain anything by sounding the alarm. You lost connection. You lost credibility in their eyes. You lost your place in rooms that preferred peace over honesty. But love compelled you to speak because silence would have made you complicit. You weren't trying to win arguments, you were trying to wake people up. The problem was never your tone. It was their addiction to comfort. When people are invested in staying comfortable, truth feels like an attack. Conviction feels like criticism, and anyone who disrupts the illusion gets labeled as negative or bitter so the illusion can remain intact. Calling you resentful allowed them to dismiss the message without examining themselves. It gave them permission to stay asleep. But labels only work in the dark. Once reality arrives, they lose their power. Now the things you spoke about are no longer opinions, they're experiences. The same people who questioned your motives are facing the consequences you tried to help them avoid. And suddenly, your clarity no longer sounds like bitterness. It sounds like foresight. You didn't want to be right. You wanted someone to listen. And now, as truth stands on its own, the burden you carried is finally being understood for what it was. What unsettled them was never just what you said it was, who you were becoming while you said it. They didn't fear your message as much as they feared the authority behind it. An authority that didn't ask for permission, didn't wait for validation, and didn't need a platform to be real. In a world that equates influence with visibility, your presence disrupted the hierarchy. You spoke with a weight that couldn't be traced to titles, degrees, or institutional backing, and that made you impossible to control. Your authority was forged through suffering, not spotlight. It was shaped in seasons where no one was applauding, where obedience was costly, and where choosing truth meant standing alone. You didn't inherit your clarity, you earned it through endurance. Through nights of wrestling with doubt, through losses that stripped you down to what was real, through moments where you had to decide whether to betray yourself to belong or stand firm and be misunderstood. That kind of authority doesn't come from platforms. It comes from refinement. Because they couldn't challenge the truth of what you carried, they attacked your character instead. Character assassination is always a defense mechanism. When systems feel threatened by something they can't disprove, they try to discredit the source. So they whispered. They questioned your stability, your motives, your loyalty. They labeled you rebellious, ungrateful, difficult, anything that would make others stop listening. Not because you were wrong, but because you were outside their control. Institutions are especially uncomfortable with truth that comes from outsiders. Systems prefer messengers they can manage. Voices that fit the script. But you didn't come from within their structure. You weren't shaped by their approval. And that made you dangerous, not because you were aggressive, but because you were free. You saw clearly without needing their endorsement, and that exposed how fragile their authority really was. Now, the platforms they trusted are quiet. The voices they elevated have faltered. The structures that seemed untouchable are shaking. But your voice remains, not because it was built for applause, but because it was built on obedience. You didn't rely on visibility to sustain you. You relied on truth. And authority rooted in lived experience doesn't collapse when systems do. It endures. While they are panicking in the storm, you recognize the weather. That's the difference. You weren't dropped into chaos, unprepared. You were raised in it. Long before the current unraveling began to shake their sense of safety, you were already learning how to stand when things fall apart. The turbulence they're experiencing as a shock to the system is familiar territory to you. You've heard this thunder before. You've felt this ground shift beneath your feet. And that familiarity is not coincidence, it was preparation. The marks you carry are not signs of weakness. They are evidence of survival. Every scar tells a story of something that tried to break you and failed. You learned early how to read between words, how to sense when unity was being weaponized, when charm was covering manipulation, when promises were being made without integrity. These weren't lessons you studied, they were lessons you lived. Pain trained your perception. Loss sharpened your instincts. Betrayal taught you how to recognize patterns before they fully revealed themselves. That's why you noticed the collapse before it happened. You recognized the same behaviors, the same power plays, the same denial cycles you had already endured on a smaller scale. What others dismissed as overthinking, you understood as pattern recognition. You weren't projecting fear, you were identifying signals. The reason you didn't flinch when things began to crack is because you already knew the sound of something breaking while pretending to be whole. You've grieved what betrayal costs. You've mourned relationships, dreams, and structures that didn't survive truth. So when you spoke warnings, they didn't come from imagination, they came from memory. You weren't guessing how this would feel. You had already walked through versions of it. And because you survived it, you could see where it leads. You weren't wrong. You were early. And being early often looks like isolation until timing catches up. You functioned as an early warning system, sounding the alarm before smoke became fire. They ignored the signal because the danger hadn't reached them yet. But now that it has, your voice makes sense. You didn't speak to scare them. You spoke because you recognized the storm long before they believed it was coming. You were never sent to blend in, soften the edges, or make truth more palatable for the sake of acceptance. You were sent to interrupt. An interruption is rarely welcomed by those who are comfortable. When your voice cut through the noise, when your words disrupted routines and challenged assumptions, they didn't pause to listen, they looked for ways to dismiss you. Mockery became their shield, gossip became their strategy. Reducing your insight to dramatics or exaggeration allowed them to return to their illusion of peace without engaging what you were actually saying. Truth, when it arrives with urgency, is often mistaken for attention-seeking. Especially in a culture conditioned to equate sincerity with performance. They assume that because your conviction was strong, your motive must be self-centered. But they misunderstood the source of your fire. You weren't speaking to be noticed. You were speaking because silence felt like betrayal. You carried a weight that demanded expression, not applause. And when people cannot imagine being moved by anything beyond ego, they project that limitation onto you. Scripture has seen this pattern before. Jeremiah wasn't rejected because his words lacked truth, but because they exposed what people didn't want to confront. He was mocked, imprisoned, and ignored, while warning of consequences no one wanted to believe would come. The destruction didn't validate him because he needed validation, it confirmed what was already true. And like Jeremiah, you didn't volunteer for this role. You were assigned to it. The urgency you carried wasn't personality, it was calling. They didn't believe you because the cost of belief was too high. Accepting your warnings would have required change, repentance, dismantling habits and systems that benefited them. So they chose dismissal instead. But clarity doesn't lose power just because it lacks polish. Truth doesn't need the right packaging to remain true. It carries its own authority. Now that the consequences are visible, the laughter has faded. The warnings they rejected are being replayed in their minds. And your voice, once treated as noise, stands as evidence that you were never meant to entertain them. You were meant to wake them. Truth has never waited for permission, and it has never bowed to rank. That's why, when pressure increased, the structures built on status began to fracture. Titles that once commanded attention suddenly rang hollow. Platforms that seemed untouchable faltered under the weight of reality. Influence based on visibility proved fragile when visibility could no longer hide what was underneath. And in that unraveling, something became clear. Authority rooted in appearance cannot withstand truth when it finally demands accountability. While many were building their voices in public, you were being shaped in private. Your discernment was not forged in applause or affirmation, but in quiet moments with God where there was nothing to perform and nowhere to hide. In solitude, your motives were refined. In stillness, your sensitivity deepened. You learned to recognize truth not by how loudly it was proclaimed, but by how consistently it aligned with integrity. Those private seasons may have felt unseen, but they were foundational. They gave you something status can't grant: clarity that doesn't waver when pressure rises. Applause is fleeting. It rises quickly and disappears just as fast when conditions change. Truth, however, endures. That's why when the noise faded, what remained wasn't the loudest voices, but the truest ones. You weren't sustained by crowds, so you weren't shaken when crowds moved on. Your words didn't depend on approval to hold weight. They were grounded in something deeper. And now, as systems struggle to maintain credibility, the difference between performance and substance is impossible to ignore. You weren't rejected because you were inaccurate. You were rejected because you were precise. You named what others danced around. You pointed to fractures while they were still being covered up. Accuracy makes people uncomfortable when they're invested in denial. So they dismissed you not to correct you, but to protect themselves. But truth doesn't fade just because it's inconvenient. Now, as rank loses its power and reputation fails to shield what's hollow, your clarity remains. Not because you rose in status, but because truth rose to the surface. And in the end, it always does. What made your presence so uncomfortable was not rebellion, but clarity. You held a blueprint they refused to use, not because it was flawed, but because it demanded change. You didn't just point out what was broken, you saw what could be rebuilt if people were willing to be honest. And in environments sustained by illusion, clarity is a threat. It strips away performance, exposes hollow leadership, and reveals where authority has been propped up by appearance instead of integrity. You named things others avoided. You called dysfunction by its true name, not to shame, but to heal. You recognized when leadership was more invested in control than in care, when unity was being used to silence truth rather than strengthen it. And because your insight didn't come wrapped in flattery, it disrupted the narrative they worked hard to maintain. You weren't attacking the structure, you were exposing the cracks that would eventually cause it to collapse. But exposure always feels violent to those committed to denial. That's why you were rejected. Not because you lacked compassion, but because transformation was required if your words were taken seriously. Accepting your clarity would have meant dismantling habits, confronting pride, and rebuilding on firmer ground. And for many, denial felt safer than deliverance. It allowed them to postpone accountability and preserve comfort a little longer. So they turned on the one holding the blueprint, hoping rejection would silence the truth. But truth doesn't disappear when it's ignored. It waits. And when collapse comes, it reveals what was always unstable. The systems that dismissed you couldn't hold under the weight they refused to address. The behaviors you warned about intensified. The consequences you tried to prevent arrived without apology. And suddenly, what you said no longer sounded extreme, it sounded accurate. You were never trying to tear things down. You were trying to prevent the fall by calling for repair while repair was still possible. But when truth is rejected, collapse becomes the teacher. And now, as illusion gives way to reality, the blueprint you carried makes sense. You weren't ahead of your time to prove a point. You were positioned to see clearly before everything else gave way. You functioned as a spiritual alarm long before the danger had a name. You sensed the heat rising while others were still asleep, convinced the house was secure because nothing looked wrong yet. That urgency you carried was never hysteria, it was mercy. It was the internal signal that something needed attention before it reached a point of no return. But urgency is rarely welcomed by those who are comfortable. When peace is built on avoidance, any interruption feels like exaggeration. They told you to calm down, to stop overreacting, to trust the process. They minimized what you were sensing because acknowledging it would have disrupted their routine. Comfort was easier than truth. Staying asleep felt safer than waking up to the responsibility your warnings implied. So instead of investigating the alarm, they hit snooze on your voice again and again, hoping the sound would fade before consequences arrived. Every time a warning is ignored, the cost increases. What could have been addressed with honesty and humility becomes something that demands collapse to be seen. You understood that. That's why your words carried urgency, not because you enjoyed tension, but because you recognized timing. You knew that delay would turn repair into recovery, prevention into survival. But timing only matters to those who are listening. When they silenced you, they thought they were preserving peace. In reality, they were postponing truth. And silence never stops reality, it only delays reckoning. Now, the quiet they demanded has become the loudest confirmation of all. The absence of voices they trusted, the failure of reassurances they believed in, the breakdown of systems they defended it, all echoes what you tried to say when it still could have changed the outcome. You were more than a warning, you were a blueprint before the breakdown. Your life, your choices, your boundaries, your insistence on integrity were showing what it looked like to live awake in a sleeping world. You weren't pointing from a distance, you were embodying the alternative. And now, as the fire spreads and the illusion of safety collapses, they're realizing that the alarm they silenced was the very thing that could have saved them time, pain, and loss. At some point, you stopped trying to convince anyone. Not because you lost conviction, but because you realized your life was saying what words never could. You became the message. While others were busy performing their beliefs, you were living yours. You chose obedience over appearance, integrity over applause, truth over trend, and though it didn't draw crowds or earn recognition, it formed something far more durable: credibility that could not be manufactured. Endurance became your influence. You kept showing up when it would have been easier to disengage. You stayed aligned when compromise was rewarded. You walked through seasons of obscurity without rewriting your values to fit the room. That kind of consistency doesn't make headlines, but it reshapes reality. Over time, people began to notice, not because you were loud, but because you were steady. When everything else shifted, you didn't. And stability in unstable times is powerful. Fame rises quickly and fades just as fast, but quiet consistency compounds. You weren't chasing momentum, you were building foundation. And now, as reputations crumble and voices lose credibility, what remains is what was rooted. You didn't need constant validation to sustain your path. You had conviction, and conviction doesn't require an audience to be real. There's a reason the story of Noah still resonates. He didn't persuade the world with eloquent speeches or popular consensus. He built. Day after day, in dry land, under ridicule and doubt, he acted on truth before evidence appeared. He looked foolish until the rain came. You lived that same pattern. You aligned your life with what you knew was coming, even when it made no sense to anyone else. And now, what once looked extreme looks wise. You didn't rely on loud prophecy. You offered living proof. Your discipline became your declaration. Your boundaries became your message. Your healing became your testimony. And as the noise fades, it isn't the most dramatic voices that endure. It's the ones whose lives quietly confirm what they've always known to be true. What they laughed at was never random suffering, it was a timeline unfolding ahead of schedule. The pain you endured was not meaningless, and it was not punishment, it was foresight in disguise. While others assumed hardship meant failure, your experiences were quietly training you to recognize what happens when truth is ignored and foundations are built on pride. You didn't just survive difficulty, you learned from it. Every season of loss, every betrayal, every collapse you endured personally became a lens through which you could see where larger systems were headed. What they mocked as misfortune was actually preparation. Pride has a way of blinding people to warning signs. It convinces them they are exempt, protected by status, intelligence, spirituality, or success. That's why your story made them uncomfortable. If your suffering could happen, then theirs was possible too. So they rewrote the narrative. They told themselves you were reckless, unstable, unlucky, anything that allowed them to believe they were immune. But your life was never a cautionary tale of failure. It was a preview, a pattern revealed early, not to shame them, but to warn them. Joseph's story echoes here. He was misunderstood, betrayed, and dismissed long before his purpose was recognized. What looked like a series of unfortunate events was actually positioning. The pit, the prison, the silence, none of it was wasted. It prepared him to recognize famine before it devastated a nation. And when the collapse came, the same ones who once rejected him found their survival in the wisdom they had ignored. You walked a similar path. You carried insight forged in obscurity, authority refined without spotlight. Divine authority rarely announces itself. It doesn't need validation to exist. You didn't need a stage for your life to speak. The silence forced on you the seasons where your voice went unheard, where your truth was dismissed, did not weaken your message. It amplified it. Now that events have caught up, that silence speaks louder than arguments ever could. Reality has confirmed what words alone could not. And now the question shifts. Where do we go from here? This is not the moment to retreat or shrink back. The collapse didn't just expose what was broken, it revealed who was prepared. It clarified assignments. It separated those who performed from those who endured. The awareness you carry is not meant to end in recognition. It's meant to move into responsibility. Clarity demands action. What you've seen, learned, and survived positions you to build, guide, and restore where others are disoriented. You're not here to revisit the past or prove anyone wrong. You're here to respond to what has been revealed. The season of insight has given way to a season of embodiment. What once lived as discernment must now take shape through intentional steps, aligned choices, and faithful presence. This is where awareness becomes impact, and where the next chapter begins. Living the assignment doesn't begin with recognition, it begins with response. Now that clarity has been given, the call is no longer to observe, but to act. This is where authority shows itself, not through permission granted by others, but through alignment with what you already know to be true. You don't need a title to walk in responsibility. You don't need consensus to move in obedience. Authority rooted in truth operates whether or not it's acknowledged, and the work you're called to do starts exactly where you are. Rebuilding rarely happens through grand gestures. It happens through daily choices that seem small, but carry weight over time. Each decision to speak honestly instead of conveniently, to choose integrity when compromise would be easier, to remain grounded when chaos invites reaction. These are the bricks of restoration. You're not responsible for fixing everything at once. You're responsible for stewarding what's been placed in front of you with consistency and care. Faithfulness compounds, even when it goes unnoticed. Boundaries are part of the assignment. Forgiveness is too. Both require discernment. Setting limits where you once stayed silent protects what's being rebuilt. Extending grace where resentment once lived prevents the past from dictating the future. And truth-telling, clear, measured, and grounded, keeps the foundation honest. You're not called to explain yourself endlessly or convince those committed to misunderstanding you. You're called to remain clear and clean in your motives. At this stage, your life becomes the sermon, not in performance, but in presence. People will learn from how you listen, how you respond, how you hold tension without losing alignment. Quiet consistency speaks louder than declarations. Over time, your steadiness will do what arguments never could. It will create trust. This assignment doesn't demand spectacle. It requires faithfulness. Showing up, staying aligned, choosing obedience when no one is watching. The world is noisy with reaction, but what it needs now are people grounded enough to move with intention. That's what you're becoming, not by force, but by faith. Standing for alignment is the quiet decision to remain faithful, even when acceptance is offered at the cost of truth. This is where the journey has been leading, not toward applause, not toward vindication, but toward obedience. You've learned by now that belonging is not the same as alignment, and being agreed with is not the same as being right. What has carried you through rejection, silence, and misunderstanding is not resilience alone, but trust that there was meaning being formed beneath the surface. God wastes nothing, not a single season you questioned, not a single door that closed without explanation, not the years you felt overlooked, unheard, or set aside. The pain you endured sharpened discernment. The rejection refined motives. The silence deepened your reliance on what is eternal rather than visible. What felt like delay was often protection. What felt like loss was preparation. Every moment was doing work in you, even when you couldn't see the outcome. Now, the season has shifted. This is not a time to replay what could have been or to wait for permission to move forward. It is time to become the answer, not by proving anyone wrong, but by living what is right. You don't need to announce your readiness, your life will demonstrate it. The same clarity that once isolated you now equips you to stand steady while others are searching for footing. You are not called to fix everything, but you are called to be present, truthful, and aligned wherever you are placed. Choosing obedience over acceptance may still cost you at times, but you already know the cost of silence, and you've learned which price leads to peace. Alignment brings a quiet confidence that doesn't depend on recognition. It allows you to move without striving, to speak without defending, to serve without resentment. And before we go any further, there is a moment to pause, to acknowledge that none of this is carried alone. This is where we turn toward prayer not as a closing ritual, but as an act of surrender, an invitation to let what has been stirred take root, to ask for protection, clarity, and courage for what comes next. So stay with me. Let's enter that moment together.